All right. You wrote the fiat standard. I think we danced around it quite a bit, but I don't know if we actually defined it. So what is fiat money? What is the history of how it came to be?
The fascinating history of the birth of the fiat monetary system is something that really only got uncovered in 2017. This is extremely, extremely interesting. In 1914, Britain joined World War I. And if you remember your history books, it's famous that this was called the August Bank Holiday. It was just going to be a few weeks where the British troops were going to go and kick European ass and come back triumphant. And most European countries believed that. But then the war kept on dragging on. And of course, to finance the war, the government, this is what they used to do under the gold standard, governments would issue bonds. So you'd issue the bonds, people would buy the bonds, the money would be used to finance the military, and then the government would pay off the bond over the next 5 or 10 or 20 years. So for World War I, the British government, the British Treasury issued bonds for financing the war. And this only came to light in 2017. Only a third of the bonds were actually subscribed. So people, British people, and this is perhaps the greatest thing that they've ever done, they decided fighting a war in Europe is just not my ideal way of investing my capital. It's a stupid thing. Why should I go and fight? Because the Austrians and the Germans and the Serbians are at each other's throats. I'd rather invest in something else. So they only bought a third of the bond issue. And then the astonishing thing that happened, which really set the tone for the next century of war, murder, Keynesianism, and theft and inflation, was that the Bank of England went and got 2 of the high-ranking officials in the Bank of England to buy the other remaining outstanding 2/3 of the bonds under their own name with a line of credit from the Bank of England. So it wasn't their own money, but they took money essentially from the Bank of England, bought 2/3 of the bonds that financed the war. And that was how England was able to keep going into the war. So that's essentially what they did, is what we today know as quantitative easing. Back then, they printed money from the Bank of England, or printed credit, gave it to those 2 employees. They bought the bonds. The government could fight the war. Sounds like it's a nice idea. And Keynes, of course, being a huckster himself, he himself said he wrote a letter to the Bank of England that was uncovered recently, and he said, "I congratulate you on this masterly manipulation." I quote it in the book. Masterly manipulation is what he called it, that they basically managed to buy the bonds using the money of the government. And of course, he never had an idea of how economics works, because he never could ask the question of, okay, and then what? All right, so we just printed money to buy 2/3 of these government bonds. What's going to happen next? What could go wrong? Not a question Keynesians ask themselves, because, their jobs depend on not thinking about what's going to go wrong.
So just a quick question about war. And as somebody who's been nonstop reading and thinking about the wars of the 20th century, and thinking that most of those wars were unjust, unethical, and destructive, how would you finance a war? So
ideally you don't. No, but I mean, of course, there are sometimes, you want to fight for self-defense. Yeah, you finance it, taxation or bonds.
So the people really need to want a war, not just with their voices, their thoughts, their tweets, or their actual financial investment.
Put up the bullets and the cost of the bullets and the bodies.
So their life and their financial well-being.
Mm-hmm. That's how it was under the gold standard, mostly, because under the gold standard, the government couldn't print gold. And so they had a budget, and they had a certain amount of gold. And that wasn't just, they couldn't infinitely increase it. They couldn't tax their population at will. And it's very difficult to take money from people. You go knock on doors and search everybody's homes, see where they're hiding their gold. It's very complicated. On the other hand, when you gave them paper money, which is what the case was in 1914, you could take their wealth just by printing the money. And that's what changed everything when it comes to war. That's why the 20th century was the century of total war. Because under the gold standard, governments fought until they ran out of their own gold. Under the fiat standard, with paper money, with credit money, governments fought until they ran out of liquid wealth in the hands of all of their citizens.
So let's find flaws in this thinking, if there's any. Okay. There's a lot of pacifist type of thinking in World War II as Hitler was expanding. Hitler framed himself as a victim of the past, of history. He never attacked anybody. Everyone's always threatening to attack him. That's kind of the narrative, and he keeps expanding. He keeps sweet talking with his charisma, all the countries around him, into sort of embracing pacifism. Stay out of the war until the war is on your doorstep. So France, just very suboptimal military strategy from the perspective of many European nations in response to Hitler. They were basically hoodwinked by his words. So then there's Winston Churchill, who stepped up and says, perhaps irrationally, from some kind of economics perspective, saying we're not going to back down. We're going to fight Germany. And perhaps that step alone is one of the biggest reasons that Hitler failed in his expansion. That decision to fight back, what's the right way to do that? If you're Winston Churchill, what's the right way to do that? If you're to fight back evil when violence is required. Now, you could argue that that no war is just, but there is such a thing as a just war index, and a lot of people argue if there is a just war in the 20th century, it's World War II. So how would you fund, if you were Britain, the war? Would you require Winston Churchill to convince the populace? Like, don't fight until they're fully convinced that this is the right thing to do. You can't just make a decision for them. You have to convince them fully so that they give their life and they give their money to support the war. Is that the right way to do it?
I think so. And I think when you have a true threat and a true evil and a true force that people really do think is genuine, you don't need to convince them. I mean, when it's real, people will want to fight and people will want to pay to fight. And I mean, I think, though, on this particular example, I think, the best way to fight Hitler is to have not fought World War I, and not take out the Kaiser of Germany. If Britain Britain and the US had not gotten involved in World War I, which really is the senseless war about nothing. Like, what was in it, and what was the goal from anybody fighting that war? If you look at it, after World War I, there were very minor adjustments in the borders of the countries that were participating. So Germany lost some land, Austria lost some land, but really it wasn't all that massive. And it wasn't like, Britain wanted to take over Germany and move their people into Germany and kick the Germans out. So there was no real value from that war. And that's why the British people didn't want to take part in it. And that's why, if they hadn't done this enormously criminal manipulation of printing money to buy the bonds, Britain wouldn't have gotten into the war. Germany would still be a kingdom, and Hitler wouldn't rise. And there'd be small changes in the borders of various European countries. I struggle to see how it could have been worse. I mean, I struggle to see who benefited from 4 years of carnage in Europe. And then this came at the height of civilization. Before that, the people of Europe had the golden era under the gold standard. They were trading with one another. They traveled, and technology was advancing, and they did not expect this war to last this long. And, my favorite story from World War I is the Christmas truce football game, which I mentioned in my book. Mm-hmm. British and German soldiers, at the height of the conflict, they stopped on Christmas Day and they played a football game against each other. I mean, this is not a real war where it's a war for survival. Britain didn't want to end Germany. Germany didn't want to end Britain. It was just kings who were emboldened by the fact that they had a printing press playing with the lives of the people. And take away the printing press, take away their ability to print money, I think we'd have had a much, much, much better 20th century.
Yeah, the counterfactual history. Neil Ferguson is a historian who gets in quite a bit of trouble. Basically, he's a Brit, suggesting that if Britain stayed out of World War I, there would be no Hitler, there would be no World War II.
Yep, I agree entirely.